Hello, and welcome to the State of 911 webinar series, hosted by the National 911 Program. My name is Sherry, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This webinar series is designed to provide useful information for the 911 stakeholder community about federal and state participation in the planning, design, and implementation of next-generation 911 systems. It includes real experiences from leaders utilizing these processes throughout the country. Today's session will feature presenters from the FCC's Task Force on Optimal PSAP Architecture, or TFOPA, Working Group, and the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board. David Hall, the chair of the TFOPA Working Group 2, also Director of Public Safety for Lower Allen Township in Pennsylvania, and Timothy May of the Policy and Licensing Division in Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau of the FCC will provide an overview of the NG911 Readiness Scorecard. And Curtis Sutton, Executive Director of the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board, will share information on the wireless location pilot project with Rapid SOS. For more information on future National 911 Program webinars, or to access archived recordings, or learn more about the National 911 Program, please visit 911.gov. Feedback or questions about the webinars can be sent to National 911 Team at mcp911.com. If you are experiencing difficulty with the WebEx application, please call WebEx Technical Assistance at 1-866-229-3239 and select option 1. Please note that all participants' phone lines have been put in a listen-only mode, and this webinar is being recorded. To ask questions of our presenters, feel free to take one of two actions. Using WebEx's chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, enter your question at any time during the presentation, and it will be entered into the queue. This feature is not visible while your screen is in the expanded page view. Or to ask your question live, use the Raise Hand feature to request your phone line to be unmuted, and you will be called upon to ask your question. With that, I would like to introduce Ms. Lori Flaherty, Coordinator for the National 911 Program. Lori, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sherry, and thank you to all three presenters today in advance. The first two, Tim and Dave, I've known for a number of years, and in both of their capacities, I will tell you that they have both gone far above and beyond in terms of advocating for 911 issues in their professional capacity. I feel really lucky to have worked with them. This particular project that the FCC undertook as part of what Sherry mentioned, the Task Force for Optimal PSAP Architecture, or TFOPA, yielded some of the most practical, useful tools for 911 professionals that are available to date. So we wanted to give them another chance to talk about them and get the word out on them. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tim May and David Hall.
Great. Thank you, Lori. Again, my name is Tim May, and I'm the NG911 Project Manager in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau of the FCC. We have a lot to cover, but before I turn the session over to David Hall, I would like to provide a quick little background on the task force. The task force was created in December 2014, specifically to focus on identifying and describing optimal PSAP system and network configuration in terms of emergency communications, efficiency, performance, and operations functionality. Now, as with any federal advisory committee, we have certain requirements, and the Commission was obligated to ensure that its membership be fairly balanced in terms of the points of view represented and the functions to be performed by the task force. So under its charter, the task force set forth to examine all aspects of the legacy 911 system and the requirements for optimal implementation in support of NG911. Therefore, the Commission appointed members from a wide range of areas. We have federal, state, tribal, local governmental authorities. We have wireline and wireless carriers represented, 911 system service providers, cybersecurity experts, the technology vendor community, and of course representatives from PSAPs and 911 authorities. Now, to focus the task force and drive near-term results, the Commission created 3 working groups. Working Group 1 focused on cybersecurity and was chaired by Jay English, then representing APCO as the Director of Communications Center and 911 Services, and now serving as APCO's Chief Technology Officer. Working Group 2 focused on optimal approach to NG911 architecture implementation and was chaired by Dave Hall, who again we'll hear from shortly. And Working Group 3 focused on optimal resource allocation, and that included some real assessments of fee-based funding of the nation's 911 system. That working group benefited from the stewardship first of Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commissioner Phil Jones, and then Jim Gerke, CEO of the Texas 911 Alliance. Now, it's important to point out that over its 2-year term, members of the task force, each with demanding full-time work schedules, devoted hundreds of hours of time and effort, all of which is represented in 2 key deliverables. The first arrived in January 2016. That is the so-called Consolidated Final Report and Recommendations. This report brought together the 3 working group reports into a single foundational document. It provides detailed guidance and recommendations that could help accelerate any state or local jurisdiction's transition to NG911. It provides a valuable blueprint for some of the key actions that are needed to put any jurisdiction's NG911 transition on track. It includes guidance for bringing the latest in technological innovation into the PSAP while ensuring that the new architecture will be cost-effective, reliable, and resilient. It describes methods to effectively and efficiently protect PSAPs against the real and expanding threat of cyber attack as they transition from the circuit switch world to the IP world. There are a number of recommendations in there for further study of funding models that will enable state and local authorities to pay for the transition, while also preventing scarce funds from being diverted to other programs. Now, following on that foundational document, and for the remaining year of its charter, the Commission assigned the task force some discrete tasks to drill down further and develop some actionable recommendations and guidance for stakeholders and decision makers. And those reports arrived in December 2016 and were adopted at the final task force meeting. Working Group 1 produced a report on optimal cybersecurity approach for PSAPs to secure them during the transition. This document introduced in some detail the concept of the Emergency Communications Cybersecurity Center, or EC3. It is essentially an additional PSAP security layer for data management, inspection, and filtering. That report includes some cost estimates. It also includes a number of links to specific information sharing environments that currently exist and which can be used to benefit public safety communications at little or no cost. Working Group 3 produced a report on an NG911 funding sustainment model. That report has some practical application and can be used by state and 911 authorities to calculate their financial needs to support a transitional NG911 implementation. It also provides an in-depth look at financial structure of the components and elements of the NG911 transition. And lastly, and the topic of our discussion today, is Working Group 2 produced the NG911 Readiness Scorecard, a guidance document for 911 authorities planning their transition to NG911. And with that, I will turn the show over to Mr. Dave Hall, a principal architect of the report.
Thanks, Tim. Very much appreciated, and it's good to be with everybody today. And thank you also, Lori, for your kind introduction. As Tim said, there were hundreds and hundreds of hours that were put in for many members. The members that are primarily responsible for a lot of some of the technical pieces to this too, and all their names can be found in both the initial report in January of 16 that Tim mentioned, and also in the supplemental report in December 16. So anybody that's interested in seeing anybody that was involved in this, and it was a multidisciplinary approach for public partnerships along with private companies that all were part of this, all extremely knowledgeable in legacy as well as the movement into the IP world of Next Gen 911. So next slide, please. So phase 2, as Tim mentioned also, the working group, we were charged with essentially 4 tasks. The first was developing an NG911 Readiness Scorecard. The second was developing a framework for NG911 planning. which is the two that we'll talk about here today. The third was a workforce staffing and training for NG911, and then the final was the EZNet, lessons learned from early adopters. And how we got to the scorecard essentially is in the first report, the January 29th report. We worked on exactly how various jurisdictions and the authorities in those jurisdictions, the 911 authorities, would take a look at where they are in the legacy world and how they would kind of configure and develop sharing models, essentially, that would fit them and maybe other jurisdictions that they wanted to team with from a cost-effective approach, because the realization was there that each individual PSAP was not necessarily going to just take on next-gen technology within their PSAP unless it was a very large PSAP, and otherwise you were partnerships associated with a lot of the core technology that would come along with these platforms. And so when we got towards the end of that initial step from the first consolidation report, we realized that the unfinished business essentially was helping 911 authorities kind of walk that tightrope into the future to determine how they were going to do this and what the steps were. Because we were hearing some jurisdictions saying, hey, we're NG911 compliant. And what we ended up realizing was that there was really no path forward in terms of defining what that meant and what criterion elements that you needed to construct and put together, essentially for a checklist, what we call the roadmap. And so that's essentially what the broadening scope was, because we also began to realize, as one of our members constantly told us, that this is just not about the PSAP. This is about a 911, a next generation 911 ecosystem. Next slide, please. And below, as you see there, is presented the TFOPA Phase 1 final report, which illustrated the role of the PSAP in a fully developed NG911 end state. So you see the PSAP is a critical piece to that, but it is attached to and receives all the various component parts of the core services that essentially rides on a transport ESInet, all the way from the originating service environment through either an IP call initially or what will eventually be the TDM call through the legacy system. Eventually it'll transition out of TDM into IP, but it'll incorporate the geographical information systems, the various extended networks, and the RF radio networks that will come into play too. So I'm not getting any of these components. They're all fully explained in the various reports. So next slide, please. So as plans for and the implementation of those NG911 systems continue, the 911 community has an opportunity to embrace this whole new paradigm, essentially. They can enhance their existing, build new cooperative, collaborative relationships and partnerships. And we talk about that in both reports. The community, the 911 community, will continue to make progress in that transition in developing this. And again, it talks about this in the final report as well as the supplemental report. So in our Phase 2 discussions, we revealed the need to create a more evolved conceptual model developed in the transitional steps to the implementation of NG911. Next slide, please. Today, many of the 911 systems remain in the legacy state. I think we all know that. And it's been a very slow transition. It's been impacted by a lot of factors, and I just listed some of them there, but it's the absence of agency buy-in in some cases, inadequate funding in other cases, incomplete or incoherent accredited standards in others, lack of stakeholder outreach, potential job losses, day-to-day demands, which don't afford time. There's a whole series of things that as we went through this process, we heard professionals in the field saying, these are the reasons why I am hitting basically stumbling blocks in my advancement forward. Next slide, please. So below became a diagram that we put together, essentially illustrating the NG911 roles and the relationships for deployment. You saw the OSE, essentially the providers that fed their call data, essentially, or session data, however you wanted to look at it in the new system, into NG911 core services, all of those things in the big giant bubble, and then ultimately connected to and utilized by the other side, essentially the PSAPs. And the PSAPs can be integrated into that system in a number of ways, depending upon configuration and size. So we looked at it more as a configuration issue as a part of how the PSAPs are configuring themselves with those core services. Next slide, please. So TFOPA, through this working group, hoped that the PSAP managers, the 911 authority managers, and elected officials, and that's really, it was the managers and the elected officials that we targeted the first consolidated report towards, because they have to understand the system if they are going to move forward, and they're going to fund, and they're going to organize, and they're going to basically embrace the whole concept of Next Gen 911. And again, we did not say that it had to be through consolidation. There were a lot of regional efforts out there, a lot of state level efforts, and ultimately it's going to have to feed through whatever the base level of 911 receipt and dispatching is, up through potentially states and or to national levels, especially on the GIS end. So all efforts had to be made to compress the timeline. It's been a very slow developing process. And we all know, we've all talked to the various providers who have said that the TDM, time division multiplexing, is the switching network is being replaced essentially by the IP deck network. And when we first started this process, we heard a lot of PSAP managers say, I'll be retired and my career will be over before this ever happens. And then we meet with some of the vendors who say that, we can't find parts anymore to the TDM network, and we're really trying to move very quickly to the IP environment. So with that in mind, we realized that there needed to be, as I said earlier, a roadmap or a readiness scorecard that kind of helped define what those steps and those processes were, and that created the supplemental report. Next step, please. So what the purpose was in the scorecard was to provide 911 stakeholders that understanding of the NG911 implementation and what we called maturity states and the essential elements that were necessary to be present in each one of those states. So the big question was, where are we in the deployment and the development and the implementation towards Next Gen 911? So with that understanding, the 911 authority stakeholders would be able to better plan, better budget, and better execute the Next Gen 911 transition. And what I've included there is essentially where you could go on the FCC website to get any of these reports, any of the PowerPoints essentially that were presented as a part of our interim reporting process. So it's essentially the link where you could, go back and research some of the things we're talking about today and actually get copies of these reports to read in more detail. Next slide, please. So the implementation continuum that we talked about, the scorecard utilizes this multi-step implementation model, consists of the following maturity states. It starts essentially with legacy, where many PSAPs are today, and moves to a step called the foundational, and then the next step called the traditional, and then the intermediate as the next step, and then the jurisdictional end state, whatever that jurisdiction may be for that next gen, that 911 authority. And then ultimately, it would end at a national end state, somewhere down range, where everybody has finally reached the whole implementation of NG911 and all of the components that we saw earlier in the diagram. So next slide, please. So the scorecard identified essential elements which were necessary in those maturity states. As we said, the essential elements categorized within that are governance, routing and location, GIS data, NG core service elements, the network, the PSAP call handling system and applications, the security and operations, and then the optional interfaces. And in the reports, we go into each one of these in far more detail than what I will be presenting today. But next slide, please. So here is an example of the face sheet, essentially, the first step that shows you all of the different maturity states that are blank. But it's the readiness scorecard as you start to see it with those steps that I talked about, the legacy, foundational, transitional, intermediate, the I3 end state jurisdictional, and the I3 end state national, and then all of the various requirements that have to be met down the side. And as you go through this, next slide, please. As you go through this, what you see is these things basically bubble out and add additional things underneath each one of them. So for the governance, you see governance structure, design, and framework, the strategic planning element, coordination, the funding and resources, and then to the right, you see that the various maturity states and what is required and what is optional there. So you see in the legacy state, we've listed optionals. The others, you see that it's not at that point yet necessarily, but each of these kind of balloons out. Next slide, please. Under routing and location, once again, you see like selective ESN routing, and I'm not going to read all of these, but you just go down and see that the geospatial routing becomes into play. When it becomes necessary is when you get to the intermediate, the I3 end state, and the other. So the X is essentially saying, is it optional or is it a necessary component when you get to each of these? Next slide, please. And in this slide, again, we go to the GIS data, and it's the same thing. So each one of these levels, governance, routing, GIS data, core service, you'll see these march out with the maturity states and what's required and what's optional. Next slide, please. And what we're building here essentially is you can take a look at where you are and with all of these component element pieces and see, do I have this in place? Do I not have this in place? Is this a planning thing? Is this a budgeting thing? Because I eventually want to get to, as a 911 jurisdiction, the I3 end state or for my jurisdiction. And then so you can basically measure where you are on this roadmap as you move forward. Next slide, please. So the important considerations, in this we moved into the framework. One was developing and formalizing an NG or a 911 planning authority. There has to be a jurisdictional established, whether it's an individual PSAP or multiple PSAPs or a state or whatever it ends up being. That all, as we talk about in the first report, the consolidated report, that all depends upon how you are organized and how you want to organize. Whether geography has something to do with that, state law has something to do with that. Who your partners are in that process, a whole variety of things. That's all locally or regionally determined. The 911 coordinator designation for that authority comes into play. The regional planning, because that might be a major cost savings for everybody. But we wrestled with the fact that we are not, as a working group, going to say that this is the best model, and that we struggle with the whole word optimal. What is optimal? Well, optimal can be considered technologically or organizationally or a whole bunch of different ways. So we laid out a whole bunch of different options and combinations of options, knowing that the local jurisdiction was going to make that determination in some way, or the regional jurisdiction. You would have to then, through the maturity states, develop formalized participation agreements. If there were not legislative mandates, you'd have to develop memorandums of understanding among the stakeholders, intra and interstate planning considerations, PSAP operational impact planning, informational sharing, collaboration, outreach programs to all of your stakeholders, essentially, as to whatever that configuration is going to be. And then the funding and the funds management piece has to be part of that as well. Next slide, please. And the planning and maturity states, again, laid out in much more detail as we moved into this. This is kind of the same thing, but that they're all laid out in the 1A and the 1B and what the requirements are for each of those moving forward. What's optional and what's required. Next slide, please. So the originating service provider, the OSP access to the NG system, you have to understand the defined term ESINet and what it is and its role, the size of the ESINet relative to its purpose over time, design of the ESINet. This all came as a part of that whole design of what the considerations were as you start to build these combination groups. The security, excuse me, and the access and prioritization risk management. Next slide, please. So our goal in the supplement to the TFOPA final report was been more specifically identify the elements required, as we talked about, and we show you a number of examples of, and it was intended to assist the PSAPs, 911 authorities, and governing authorities and interests in their policy development and their movement towards as a planning model, basically, that you could overlay over top of what your efforts were, determine where you were and where you needed to go in terms of planning as you move forward in the development of NG911 for your jurisdiction. So through the checklist, authorities would move through that various implementation maturity states and the continuum to full deployment end state. Next slide, please. So although the supplemental report can be read as a standalone report, again, we encourage readers to review the January 29th document. They serve together for elected officials, managers, and 911 authorities to better understand the challenges and the need to move to the multimedia NG911. We say that, obviously everybody knows that that's essential. Your citizens deserve it. The deaf and hard of hearing community requires it, actually. They've been left out in many ways over the years in this. And the 40-plus-year-old TDM switching environment has reached its end of life. And so the transition becomes ultimately essential. So we can move toward it in a planned transition, or we can wait, deny, and resist, and ultimately reach a point of crisis in 911. And we think that the 911 community has been looking for a way to define where that is and where they need to go. And we saw that this whole scorecard was a necessary thing in order to assist in that as basically a planning model for everybody. So next slide, please. And we'll defer questions to the end, I think, Sherry, right?
Thank you. Actually, we'll start the QA portion of our session for this right now. And as a reminder, to ask a question, please use the WebEx chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, or press the raise hand button so we can unmute your phone line.
Thank you, Sherry. Our first question today: are there any plans to continue or reconstitute TFOPA?
So this is Tim. I'll take that one. At present, no. And I would point out, though, and as Dave has described, just one aspect of it, there's a significant amount of work on paper right now. And again, I cannot encourage everyone strongly enough to go and look at it. I mean, there's a lot there to get people moving forward. But I want to point out that there's another federal advisory committee that the Commission has, which is much more longer running, and it's the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, and in its sixth chartering. And there is an NG911 focused working group there, and they are presently focused on transition issues, particularly with respect to originating service providers, and ensuring the system reliability and resiliency during a transitional period. So we've got them looking at best practices and developing additional guidance regarding, monitoring, reliability, notifications, and accountability in preventing 911 outages. So there's two tasks. One is really focused on the larger system, and then task two is looking at small carrier considerations as well. So that is going to be an important body of work, and that's going to be a critical piece of the overall transition because, as Dave, when we look at these architecture diagrams, we always start on the left, and who's sitting over there on the left? It's the providers, and so we need to ensure that they understand their responsibilities and the demands that might be made on them as we move forward. Dave, I don't know if you wanted to add something. But.
No, I think that's true, and. I think if you take a look at those reports, and as Tim said, there's tremendous amount of information in there, some of which we can't provide to the authorities, some of which the authorities themselves are going to have to feed into that. We provided the outline for what you need to do, but there's a lot of things that the authorities themselves are going to need to do too. So I think that, but the other thing, Tim, is the service providers have to do their piece on the front end, or the whole system basically, doesn't work. So I think that's another critical piece moving forward.
Thank you, gentlemen. The next question asks, what are the criteria pointers for NG911 Readiness Scorecard?
I'm not sure I know what by criteria pointers. I think all of those elements that are listed on the scorecard are criteria pointers. I mean, you just have to read each one of those sections and see what they are, and then that kind of defines, what you need to do in terms of analysis of your situation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this is Tim. I would supplement that with we and I think the task force recognized this. The 911 jurisdictions, they're all coming at this from different starting points, and so I think they've developed the foundational set of criteria that you would need to have a good handle on as you move in and bring whatever you've accomplished to date, and then say, okay, well, did I do everything I needed to do as I move through these maturity stages? Go ahead, Sherry. Sorry.
Okay, the next question is for Dave. How can we encourage more states to start the implementation for NG911?
Well, that's a good question because the politics come into play when you do that. I started in this process when I was with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, and I was their representative to NASNA. And I think NASNA has done a tremendous amount of work on this from their state levels, and I know Sherry Lori was very involved in the process at that point, and still is. And I think there's been a lot of encouragement, but I think getting down to the individual state laws associated with this and having those jurisdictions, every state's different, which was the other thing that we ran into as we started looking at these criteria. So I think you have to talk to your politicians, whether they be state level or otherwise, and I think that's the reason why we tried to orient that first report towards those individuals. And take the report and distribute it freely, even among whatever the elected official is, and encourage them to read it and to see that this is the system moving forward. Because what we saw was a lot of confusion among elected officials. Next Gen 911 was out there and everybody's talking about it, but nobody really knew what the component pieces were or what things had to be accomplished in order to make it happen. Encourage a state 911 plan. I know Pennsylvania's put out a very robust one, and it's been well received in their system. And I know a lot of other states have done the same thing. So it's really just encouraging your elected officials to get on the bus and make this thing happen in concert with what Tim and the FCC are doing and what the providers are putting together. NENA has been a strong advocate of that, so has APCO. And I think it's getting everybody together to move this whole concept forward.
Thank you, Dave. The last question submitted for this session, how did you determine the transition steps?
That's through a lot of, essentially through a lot of discussion within the subgroups. There was a lot of debate back and forth as to what they are, but we didn't want to make them. You didn't want 24 steps, but by the same token, you didn't want to just have 3. So I think when we took a look at the various pieces to that, we saw that legacy was legacy, and that it was a natural transition from the legacy step moving forward into the next piece that we looked at. And then, ultimately it became you had to have a jurisdictional, whether the jurisdiction was a state or whether the jurisdiction was multiple PSAPs within a region or whatever it was. As long as they could support the core services piece, then they would function within the model. But and so it could be a variety of levels depending upon funding and capability and what your 911 authority was and what your state laws were. In absence of state laws, what the regional agreements were. So it just seemed natural that those steps in that continuum were the places where you could define it and who would have jurisdiction over saying, yes, we are at this point. So it was really, that's all it was in discussion and trying to come up with what they were.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hall and Mr. May. Lori, if you would, please go ahead and introduce our second speaker.
Thanks, Sherry. Our next speaker, Mr. Curtis Sutton, has been the Executive Director of the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board since 2014, which is when I met him. And that state, under his leadership, has won numerous awards for their work in the area of 911. They've been an early adopter, they've been an innovator, and Curtis is here today to talk about another project that they've decided to take on to deliver device-based hybrid location information to 911. So without further ado, Curtis, the floor is yours.
one of the things that we wanted to discuss was the misconception that Next Generation 911 actually improves location technology. It doesn't. And that's a very important thing for the 911 community to know going forward. We are doing things in Tennessee like building out our own alley database, but the network itself will not improve Next Generation 911 location technology. Realizing this, the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board began a partnership with Rapid SOS to test device-based location technology through their clearinghouse. So what's the problem with the current technology? And if we can move to the next slide, that'd be great. So we all carry smartphones now, and smartphones have really kind of changed the way that we live. They have extraordinary capabilities, from texting, video, health data, route planning, ordering pizzas and ride share. All those things are there, but it doesn't really translate when we call 911. So we have a highly sophisticated computer in our pockets that fundamentally change the way we communicate and interact with each other, but not the way that we communicate with Next Generation 911. So our calls to 911, and even with our smartphones now, do not give precise location. We get it with cell tower triangulation, sometimes with GPS, but we don't get Wi-Fi access points or anything else like that. We don't have real-time health or medical information. We don't connect over any type of medium. We don't get camera feed. We have texting in some areas of the country. About 15% of PSAPs in the United States have texting. And the location with texting can be even worse than a 911 phone call. We don't have video conferencing to 911. We don't have route planning or emergency contacts that go along with our 911 phone call. If we can move to the next slide, please. Let's talk about how location works today. And what we need to know and understand is that today the wireless carriers deliver 911 location when you place a phone call to 911. And what that means is that the location will always be network-centric. That means the query for location will always come from the wireless network. That also explains why you only get phase 1 or cell tower or cell sector location. If you rebid, the network then goes out to the device and basically gets its GPS location data from its GPS chip and tries to get a fix on that chip. If they get it, that's great, but if you know how GPS works, you'll understand why it doesn't work so often. For GPS, you need to have a clear line of sight to a satellite. And if you're indoors, that's not going to work. So the network falls back on the cell tower triangulation. Sometimes there's no phase 2 at all. Obviously, in big industry organizations like NENA and APCO and regulators like the FCC, they've all recognized the need for getting better indoor location. So we're embarking on a project called the National Emergency Address Database. And it's going to be a database where building owners or building managers upload information to for their Wi-Fi access points. So when someone installs a Wi-Fi access point in their home, someone would need to enter that into the database. But the problem with that is you have to rely on consumer input. You have to rely on people to continue to update that record. And that it can be problematic. The database can be good for the first 30 days, and then after that, it's going to change dramatically. If we can go to the next slide, please. So with device-based location, how do we do that? Rapid SOS uses something called device-based hybrid, or some people call it fused location. And let's try to figure out what that means. Most importantly, it's device-based, which means the calculation happens on the device, not on the network. The device has access to all the sensors, not just the ones that the carriers can access through their control plane. It's also hybrid, which means it combines different sensors based on context and environment. Of course, they use cell towers, which is reliable but not very accurate. They use GPS, which is accurate but only outdoors if it has the line of sight to the satellite. Most importantly, they use Wi-Fi access points, but not the way that the national database uses them. Instead of trying to get an indoor address for one particular Wi-Fi access point, Google and Apple have huge machine learning algorithms that do Wi-Fi access point fingerprinting, which means that every time your phone sees a Wi-Fi access point, you don't need to be connected to it, just see it. Your device reports back to Google or Apple where the phone thinks you are in relation to that Wi-Fi access point. And if millions of phones do that thousands of times a day, you can imagine that they're pretty good at that technology. They also use Bluetooth beacons, although we'll have to see how that really works and where they play a role or not, but they use barometric pressure sensors and all sorts of other things like dead reckoning, when they can track your steps and calculate your indoor location based on a gyrometer or accelerometer to get your GPS fix. It becomes very clear from all of this that the device-based location is pretty accurate. There's a huge commercial interest in improving location accuracy for things like targeted advertising in shops, indoor navigation in malls or airports. But in public safety, we don't really have that in today's environment, but we could be building toward it. Using commercial location technologies makes a lot of sense for faster and more dynamic response. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So let's look at how the data gets sent to the clearinghouse from the device. The important thing to know here is that Google has already done a lot of legwork for the Android system. They've implemented the AML standard, which stands for Advanced Mobile Location, which means someone that dials 911, the location gets computed on the phone and sent to an endpoint. They deployed this successfully in other parts of the world, like England, New Zealand, Australia. But in the U.S., they haven't switched it on yet because PSAPs couldn't receive it until now. But the software is already installed on every Android device, more than 100 million devices. It will be activated over the air. There's nothing that the customer needs to do. It's not an app, it's part of the operating system. Another service that's capable is what is called Rapid SOS Beacon Service. It's something that Rapid SOS offers to device manufacturers or operating systems that have chosen not to implement the AML standard. The architecture behind it is different, but the outcome is the same. When somebody dials 911, location will be sent in the background. No app is involved. It's part of the operating system. Lastly, apps can play a role. We know that 911 folks are somewhat skeptical of apps, and we get that. We don't want to tell people to use an app instead of calling 911. We've been preaching for 50 years now that 911 is the number to call in emergencies. But there's a lot of development of apps out there now. Rapid SOS has launched a free and super easy to use app called SOS Beacon for testing and for demonstrations. But some PSAPs also advertise it to their citizens. They've also included this functionality in their old app called Haven. More excitingly, they are partnering with some big organizations like AAA, putting this code behind their existing apps that have millions of downloads for active users. In a way, apps will always have a place because it makes it so much easier to innovate and bring new features. As you can imagine, getting something done for 100 million devices on the system can take a while, so apps are a good stopgap and a showcase for what's possible to be developed. So how do we get the location that's sent to the clearinghouse when someone dials 911? Let's take a look at that. There we go. So someone dials 911 on the phone. The call goes to the wireless carrier. The wireless carrier is in charge of routing it to the right PSAP. The PSAP queries the alley database, which at this point only has the cell tower address. Then the carrier goes out to query the phone for the location, which takes a while. The NG911 is not changing any of that. The new networks are not changing any of that. All that's regulated by the FCC, and they're not intercepting or changing anything here. But something's happening in parallel. The millisecond that someone dials 911, Android ELS wakes up and sends location to the clearinghouse. As soon as your call taking or CAD software has the calling party phone number, they go out and query the clearinghouse. This advanced location is going to display on your screen, including your map, within milliseconds of phase 1. There's no need to rebid, there's no need to wait. All this happens automatically and instantly. You'll start to get phase 1 and afterwards phase 2, but when a better device location is available, you'll have it as a supplemental location. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. And so Tennessee had decided to partner with RapidSOS to test this out. Basically, the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board met and received a proposal from RapidSOS and voted to enter into this project. The project being led by the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board, Jennifer Estes being our chairman, Eddie Burchell being the chief of technology here at the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board, and Ryan Hart-Eckel of RapidSOS, the VP of Product and Public Safety. And what we're trying to do is to provide this test bed without causing any undue hardship or financial strain on the local PSAPs. So this is being done at no cost to the PSAPs for those that choose to participate. The vendors that have partnered with the PSAPs to participate in this test have so far been doing this without any cost directly to the PSAP. If we can go to the next slide, please. So there's 4 objectives for the pilot project. First is to improve location accuracy and the speed of location accuracy and delivery for wireless 911 calls made by device through the RapidSOS clearinghouse. 2 is to demonstrate that location data can be transmitted to a PSAP in the background of the 911 call without using an app. And 3 is to generate a case study to serve as a reference for NG911 success ahead of the nationwide deployment of such a solution. And finally, showcase the value of a close collaboration between PSAPs, 911 administrators, technology companies, and public safety software vendors. Next slide, please. So the findings from stage 1 of the pilot were very encouraging. We found that location from device-based hybrid location technology is more accurate and more reliable than the carrier available location, especially indoors. The NG911 clearinghouse mechanisms transmit location faster and update more frequently than current alley mechanisms. And from a usability perspective, it's helpful that the integration is done into existing PSAP equipment, that the call takers to dispatchers don't have to add another screen. And in the sake of time, we're going to skip over the next slide. In fact, if you can go to 2 slides down, please. One more. Actually, let's go with this one. I'm sorry, go back, please. What we found in testing is 97% of calls within a 50-meter accuracy, even for calls made from indoors. So you're looking at this graph. We have, you can see that 40 to 50% were less than 10 meters distance to ground truth, which is closest to actual location. More than half of all carrier calls were greater than 50 meters away. So if you compare the device-based location to the carrier location, between 10 meters and 50 meters for carrier location. And we kind of found that the carrier location was all over the place. If we can go to the next slide, please. Actually, let's skip down to the following slide. Here's just kind of a representation in Washington County, Tennessee, that we can show that carrier location was much more inconsistent. You can see the blue dots carrier location. I'm sorry, the blue dots rapid SOS location, and the pink dots there would be the carrier location. The rapid SOS device-based location was pretty much on top of exactly where we were calling. The carrier location was kind of all over the map here. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Similar result in Loudoun County. Carrier location much more inconsistent than the rapid SOS clearinghouse location. The next slide simply shows the rapid SOS location and the alley location are displayed side by side. This is a screenshot from a Zetron Max, but rapid SOS in Tennessee is integrated with many other systems. All the vendors we work with have integrated with rapid SOS without any cost to the PSAP. So what are we trying to do now? If we can go to the next slide. We're trying to expand the footprint of the test bed, and you can see all the counties that are excited and lined up to join this test with rapid SOS. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in reading the official report on the first part of the test, you can go to this website, info.rapidsos.com/blog/Tennessee-pilot project, and that'll give you a full report of what we've done in Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. So we'll go ahead and start the QA portion of our session. And as a reminder, to ask a question, you can use the WebEx chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, or press the raise hand button so we can unmute your phone line.
Thank you, Sherry. The first question, what CAD and CPE vendors did you use for your pilot?
We had a variety, and I can't name all of them right now, but Rapid SOS has integrated with a tremendous amount of vendors out there. I know that they have a list on their website. If you go to that report, you'll be able to see, or you go to the website that contains the report, you'll be able to see who they have integrated with. But they're doing a lot. I know they've even began to integrate with Rave, that does the Smart 911 project, and that system is started working with Rapid SOS. Mostly Zetron and Pulsium for the first stage of the pilot project, but there's a whole host of others that Rapid SOS is working with.
Thank you. The next question asks, are changes needed for each wireless device?
That will be done by the wireless device manufacturer, is my understanding. So the consumer will not have to do anything. In order to turn on that technology, the device manufacturer will have to do that itself.
Okay. Knowing what you know now, is there anything you would do differently?
You know, not really. We had just a tremendous amount of interest in this project. I don't think that it could have actually gone any better. You can see that we started out with just a few PSAPs at the beginning, and then we have, I don't know, 30 or 35 PSAPs now that are willing to come onto the test, and so we're really excited about it. I'm glad that we did it. You know, I don't know if we could have done it sooner than we started, but I don't think there's anything else during the testing of the clearinghouse technology that we would have done differently.
All right. So thank you, Curtis, for your persistence in staying on and redialing in. I don't know if David and Tim are still on, but I again want to thank all three of you for presenting today. And as we did mention earlier, our next webinar is scheduled on Tuesday, February 13th at noon Eastern Time. And we have the link to register for that here on the slide. And again, the recording from today's webinar will be available at 911.gov, and I will chat with Lori Flaherty to see if we can get a time scheduled to possibly redo this portion of the webinar, Curtis, since I know we did lose some people, but they will at least be able to access the recording once we get that posted. So thanks to everyone that stayed with us.